Tonight, everyone is talking about lowering the property tax, but how much will competing plans actually save Texans?
There's one thing they agree on, and that's that taxes do need to come down.
Will what eventually passes actually make a difference? Plus, declaring chaos on the southern border.
To get something done, it is going to take a bipartisan solution, which means
Republican lawmakers keep hammering the Biden administration as they tour the Rio Grande Valley, and the Texas GOP censures one of its own. And later, blocking some teens from accessing firearms. Lawmakers file a new bill requiring certain mental health records to be passed on to police. Capitol Tonight starts right now. Thanks for joining us here on Capitol Tonight. I'm Karina Kling. Property taxes are complicated, but the one thing Texas homeowners say is pretty simple. They're too high and are begging for relief. State lawmakers promise to help, but they're split over how best to lower them. The House wants to control how much appraisals go up while cutting tax rates too. A part of their plan would mean a home's taxable value could only increase 5% rather than the 10% today. The cap would also apply to properties like grocery stores, apartment complexes, and rental homes. Right now, the Senate's plan focuses on raising the homestead exemption from $40,000 to $70,000. That's the share of a home's appraised value that is exempt from property taxes. For example, if you have a home that's worth $200,000, you'd be taxed for only $130,000 of it. But we haven't seen a critical part of the Senate plan, which is how much they would cut property tax rates. Our Charlotte Scott has more on the potential savings Texans could see.
It's a joke. It's a joke.
Jack Kesterson is talking about those property tax proposals from Texas lawmakers. He purchased his South Austin home in 2006. He didn't take me there for privacy reasons, but he says he pays more than $10,000 in property taxes for a 1,000 square foot home. The House proposal would save homeowners an average of $460 a year. The Senate's would save them about $341 annually.
$350 out of $10,000? Come on. That's not even 10%.
But tax expert Dale Kramer says the Senate still has more legislation to introduce on property taxes, so that savings number could be much higher. This is just what we know so far.
They will use additional money to buy down property tax rates further. So I don't think we've seen the complete Senate plan yet.
Kramer says the median price of a home in Texas is $340,000. The owner would pay about $6,000 in property taxes every year. And even though Kesterson doesn't think lawmakers are doing all they can to reduce property taxes, Kramer says a few $100s per year could help someone who really needs it.
Obviously, the very high-end properties pay a lot more property tax, and maybe $400 of tax relief doesn't mean a lot to them. But for someone who owns a $250,000 home and is barely making their mortgage payments, $400 can be a godsend.
Kramer says another way lawmakers could cut property taxes is by funding schools. If schools get more money from the state, they'll require less money from taxpayers.
It's kind of like a game of poker, and not all the cards yet have been dealt.
But Kesterson wishes Texas would just have an income tax instead. He's seen many neighbors priced out of the area.
They live in a house that started out costing $6,000 and is now worth $800,000 just for the property. And the city in the state is charging them taxes on all of that. So they have to sell these houses. They can't afford them.
For Capitol Tonight, I'm Charlotte Scott.
And with us now to talk more about property tax relief is North Texas Republican State Representative Brian Harrison of Midlothian. Welcome back to the program.
Always great to be with you, Karina.
Yeah,
thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming. You want to take property tax relief a big step further.
Yes.
You just filed a bill to abolish property taxes in Texas. I'm sure most homeowners would be like, great.
Yes.
How's this in reality going to work?
Well, it would be great in reality. Look, I mean, property taxes, especially never-ending property taxes, they are unethical and they need to be abolished. One of the many things that President Reagan taught us is that they need to paint with bold colors, no pale pastels. And perhaps in Texas, there's no better place to apply that principle than on the area of private property rights. We either mean and are serious about private property rights in Texas, or we're not. Texans they know their property taxes are out of control. I just watched one of the Texans interviewed there calling the reform proposals, some of them, a joke because of the measly amount that may or may not be saved. We have been trying to reform property taxes in Texas for a generation. And what do we have year after year? homeowners are still having to write a check bigger than the year before. And we have record numbers of Texans losing their homes because they effectively have government landlords. You rent in Texas, you're not an owner, even if you've paid off your home. So I'm proposing a bold proposal for a property tax-free Texas to amend the Constitution and say within 5 years, every city, county, school district in Texas, you've got to transition away from property taxes.
Well, I'm sure you would have some pushback from counties, local city governments, but it's part of this replacing it with a higher sales tax. Is that part of what you're looking to do? And how would that offset? How would that work?
So definitely not with an income tax. I'm really proud of the constitutional prohibition on income taxes. I'm just looking to add a constitutional prohibition on property taxes as well. See, it's a math problem at the end of the day. Governments need to buy goods and services, so they spend money, and then it's just a question of how do they tax Texans. And I'm simply asking all political subdivisions of the state to transition away from taxing people based on a completely unethical system that precludes any Texan from ever owning their home. And think about the economic benefit to this. There have been studies. Texas GDP would absolutely skyrocket. This would be the largest economic and business development program ever comprehended in the state of Texas. We could do away with all of the fights over property tax rates or appraisal values or 313s or what type of economic development programs we need, because Texas, if we abolish property taxes, we would go from just being the economic engine of America, which we are. Texas would become the economic juggernaut for the world.
Well, and just continuing to speak to that, I mean, you also have legislation that would mean voters would get to decide on how property tax increases. Do you think that's a more doable proposal this session in terms of sending it to the voters?
Right. So I am not opposed to trying to tackle property tax reform. You mentioned at the top of the program, you know, the Senate has some proposals, the House has some proposals. I have even filed one myself, which is basically to say that while property taxes should be abolished, until they are abolished, if you're going to raise property taxes, you at least should have the decency to do the right thing, put property owners, put taxpayers back in charge, and let them hold an election and let them decide whether they agree with you if you want to raise property taxes.
Well, and speaking to that, lastly, I just want to ask you, because I mean, you are likely to get pushback from cities, from counties on this, saying they need to operate government, they need to pay for a new fire truck. Yeah. I mean, what have you heard from?
I haven't heard pushback on that front, because again, we're not saying that. I mean, I agree, spending should come down. That's critically important as for a small government, conservative. The people who are paying taxes, they want to make sure their governments aren't spending a penny more than they have to. But my proposal is actually silent as to revenue neutrality for any local government. I'm simply saying if you're going to tax your citizenry at X number of dollars, do it via a much more fair system of taxation and not one that forces people to pay perpetual rent to the government. I want Texans to be able to throw off the shackles of their government landlords. And finally, for the first time in Texas, be able to own your own home.
We will continue to watch this, and we'll get you back on to talk more about it. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Corinna.
Thank you. Florida Governor and likely presidential candidate Ron DeSantis rallied Texas Republicans in Houston and Dallas this weekend. Both events were closed to the media, but a Houston attendee broadcast the speech live on Facebook. DeSantis proclaimed Texas and Florida partners against what he called the woke left. He also praised Texas's conservative influence on the nation. But DeSantis rarely mentioned Governor Abbott as speculation grows about whether the two mega-state leaders will become rivals in a bid for the White House. Texas Republicans censured one of their own this weekend. San Antonio Congressman Tony Gonzalez was dinged in a rare move by his state party. They aren't happy with his vote to support new gun safety laws after the Uvalde school shooting in his district, among other bills he supported or opposed. The censure means the state party could come off the sidelines if Gonzalez runs again in 2024 and fund a primary opponent. Gonzalez continues to defend his votes, and following the censure got backup from the national campaign arm for House Republicans. The censure resolution also pointed to Gonzalez's opposition to a border security bill being pushed by a fellow Texas Republican. More than 2 months into their new majority, House Republicans have not advanced any significant legislation to address what they call a crisis. Our Washington reporter Rena Diamante looks at the likelihood of any meaningful action by Congress.
Monday marked the 16th time Congressman Tony Gonzalez led a delegation to the southern border since taking office in 2021.
We listened to the superintendent of the Uvalde School District, where he told me, the man is almost in tears, saying the school district goes into lockdown 3 or 4 times a week due to the smugglers coming through and these high-speed chases.
The House Republican Conference is working towards a border security bill that a majority of its members can get behind. Some Republicans are divided about what the legislation should look like.
In April, the House is going to pass a series of border security measures. I am pushing for these security measures to be real, tangible measures that can actually solve problems.
Anything that gets through the House faces a hurdle in the Senate, which is controlled by Democrats. Senator John Cornyn led a delegation of his Republican colleagues to the Rio Grande Valley on Friday. He said he wants any legislation to impose consequences on migrants who cross the border between ports of entry.
Some people are showing up at the border and turning themselves in. You've seen that phenomenon time and time again. And if they're just simply released into the interior of the country, then the perception is, well, I can come too.
Democrats in Congress are split over the issue as well. Some oppose President Joe Biden's plan to impose new restrictions that would make it difficult for most people who cross the border illegally to obtain asylum. Political science professor Alvaro Corral believes there could be modest movement this Congress when it comes to new technology related to border security and pathways to citizenship for a narrow group of undocumented immigrants.
Both kind of getting a little bit of what they want. But in terms of like a major either asylum crackdown or a major, pathway to citizenship for many millions of people, I think not, both of those seem very unlikely.
Last month, Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar arranged for House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries to take a tour with border officials in Laredo. Cuellar tells us Jeffries recognized that technology at ports of entry should be improved to better screen vehicles for smuggled drugs. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capital Tonight.
Authorities say 4 U.S. citizens kidnapped in Mexico were not the intended victims. A U.S. official familiar with the story says the victims crossed into Matamoros on Friday. They were assaulted and kidnapped after their car crashed with another vehicle, and they were targeted in a case of mistaken identity. The Mexican president said he believes the Americans had crossed the border to buy medicine. The FBI is working with the Mexican government on the investigation. Still to come on Capitol Tonight, expanding reproductive health care in Texas, how some lawmakers are pushing to get birth control and legal abortions covered, plus closing a critical loophole for gun background checks, why measures gain bipartisan support at the Texas Capitol. Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. Let's get a check now of some of the other political stories making headlines across Texas. State lawmakers are considering a bill that would let victims of child sex abuse file lawsuits against their abusers no matter how long it's been. The current statute of limitations for these lawsuits allows victims up to age 48 to seek monetary damages, but a bill to eliminate the age limit has bipartisan support in the House, and another version was filed in the Senate. The state legislature is also looking at proposals to make sure juveniles with a history of serious mental health issues don't have access to firearms. Texas law requires county and district clerks to provide law enforcement with information on involuntary mental health hospitalizations. Under bipartisan legislation in the House and Senate, local clerks would be required to share those records about juveniles 16 and older. This comes after an investigation by ProPublica and the Texas Tribune found that local clerks were not including files about minors in their reports, either because of office policy or they did not think it was required. Lawmakers and abortion rights advocates gathered at the Texas Capitol today to introduce a bill to provide insurance coverage for reproductive health care. Their proposed Rosies Law would allow legal abortions and contraception to be covered by both private insurance and the state's Medicaid program.
Every pregnancy and every Texan's circumstances are different, but one thing stands. No one should be denied coverage for any reproductive services just because they're poor.
The bill is named for Rosie Jimenez, who could not afford a physician and died in 1977 from an unsafe abortion. We want to bring in the Quorum Reports' Harvey Kronberg now to weigh in on what's happening at the Texas legislature. Harvey, good to see you.
Happening over there.
Nothing. A few stories there, and let's talk about some other things. Our top story tonight was the differing House and Senate plans over how best to provide property tax relief for Texans. I mean, are you surprised that the chambers are split on this, the seeming feud between Phelan and Patrick?
Well, it's a metaphor for the broader feud between them. I don't think either one particularly respects the other, but they have to deal with each other. I always tell friends that don't follow politics that it's not Democrat versus Republican in the Texas legislature. It's House versus Senate. And the Senate has essentially become very docile under the management of the lieutenant governor. The House is still more of a bottoms-up kind of organization where there's robust debate and people change their minds, vote their districts more frequently anyway than they do in the Senate. So the difference between the two plans, I would probably say the House plan is more punitive towards counties and local taxing authorities, but would probably cap property taxes more effectively than the Senate plan.
What about their other priorities and kind of how they differ on that? What do you see being the biggest fight between the House and Senate?
Vouchers.
Yeah.
Frankly, I'm sorry, we're supposed to call it school choice now, or education scholarships. Vouchers is apparently a loaded term. But the lieutenant governor has promised everybody that he will force us into one special session after another until we get vouchers. The speaker comes from a rural district and is not particularly sympathetic to the concept. And in fact, the two committees that it would have to go through in the House are pretty much anti-voucher committees. So it looks like it could be a long summer, except if Governor Abbott really does have presidential aspirations, he can't be bullied into special sessions by his lieutenant governor and then presume that he's going to look presidential going forward.
Yeah, interesting, but he's really pushing for so-called school choice and whatnot, the legislative session as well. I want to ask you, there's been a backlash against so-called ESG investing, and we'll get into that a little bit, but Texas has passed laws punishing investment firms that use environmental, social, and governance metrics. That's what the ESG is in their decision making. I mean, now there's been another bill that's been filed to take it another step. Can you explain kind of what's going on here and the big pushback from some of these companies?
Well, ESG has become the equivalent of the Green New Deal, which was kind of an amorphous set of metrics moving us towards a greener society with more diversity, et cetera. And it's become a shibboleth for the right, kind of a catch-all for everything they dislike. It's become a caricature, much like the term woke has become a caricature on the other side. But in Texas, we passed a bill that said major finance houses could not do business with Texas retirement funds if they endorsed ESG or were perceived to be anti-fossil fuel. Well, theoretically, that's punishing these big financial firms, but say BlackRock. They're worth $10 trillion. Our book of business with them is maybe, I don't know, 5 or 10 billion. It's couch change. So the net result has been that they don't participate in for instance, underwriting bonds for school districts and counties, which means that there's less competition, which means it costs the counties and school districts and their taxpayers more to underwrite bonds. So the people that are actually being punished are the taxpayers. Now they're talking about doing that with insurance companies. Right. And I'm not exactly sure how you would do that, but property and casualty companies look at risk, and you're essentially paying to reduce your risk. If they put this friction on insurance companies, I'm rarely pro-insurance company, but if they put this kind of friction on insurance companies, the ones that will suffer the most will be the
Welcome back. President Biden is calling on Congress to pass landmark voting rights legislation. He spoke in Selma, Alabama for the 58th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. That's when civil rights protesters were beaten by law enforcement as they tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Biden wants lawmakers to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act, which restrict partisan gerrymandering and make it easier for people to vote. Both bills are stalled in Congress. But Biden is gearing up for other legislative battles as his administration gets ready to release its budget proposal on Thursday. He faces a tough fight in the U.S. House where Republicans hold the majority. Washington reporter Torian Small breaks down the congressional climate ahead of the announcement.
President Joe Biden will show his hand first, unveiling his proposed federal budget on Thursday. The White House now asking Republicans in Congress to lay their cards on the table as well.
We have called on Republicans in the House to do the same, to be transparent, to lay out exactly what it is that how they want to move forward with the fiscal year.
Biden will take a different tact with his budget proposal for the year beginning October 1st. He'll reveal the details in a speech to supporters in Philadelphia on Thursday instead of releasing it in Washington.
This is kind of the next iteration when we realize that president's budget submissions don't really come with a lot of congressional response. They don't require Congress to actually act on them. Knowing that Congress doesn't have to respond and he wants to showcase exactly what he wants to prioritize, it makes sense that we start putting it in kind of a campaign atmosphere.
Those priorities are likely dead on arrival by the time they reach new House Speaker Republican Kevin McCarthy, who's demanding spending cuts in return for House Republicans agreeing to raise the nation's borrowing limit.
That's the question everyone's trying to figure out, how to make the math work. When you start eliminating the ones that have the potential to be cut, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, defense, those are the big budgetary ticket items where if you remove those from the table, then you're left with such small options to get the budget cuts that they've promised.
The president is insisting on an increase in the debt ceiling with no strings attached. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warns the U.S. could reach its borrowing limit this summer, triggering an economic crisis if not raised.
She says we're about 3 or 4 months away from, true disaster here. Is that not at all concerning that, there can't be some deal?
Yeah, and that should be concerning to House Republicans. It should be, because this is something that has been done, again, multiple times over the last several decades. And this is something that is their constitutional duty to do, is to lift the debt ceiling.
The president and the House Speaker sat down more than a month ago to begin negotiations. According to McCarthy, they haven't talked since. In Washington, Torian Small, Spectrum News.
And that is all the time that we have tonight. Join us again tomorrow for the latest in Texas politics. Until then, thanks for watching. Have a great night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. And for more refreshing stories about your community, click the subscribe button right over here. You can also download our Spectrum News app to get live news coverage, weather alerts, and more wherever you are. And don't forget to tune in to Channel 55 on Dish and DirecTV for live local reporting every single day. We'll see you then.